On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, a black BMW pulled onto the gravel drive of the Hendricks farm, and Harold Hendricks knew his time had come. He'd been expecting this visit for 3 months. The certified letters, the phone calls, the increasingly urgent demands from First National Bank of Cedar Rapids. $23,000. Past due. Interest accumulating. Legal action imminent. Harold was 74 years old. He'd farmed this land for 52 years since he was 22, since his father had handed him the keys to the tractor and said, "It's yours now, son, take care of it." He'd taken care of it. Through the good years and the bad ones. Through droughts and floods and prices that rose and fell like the tides. He'd raised 3 children on this land, buried his wife beside the old oak tree, watched his grandchildren learn to walk in the same fields where he'd learned to plow. But the 1980s had been cruel to farmers like Harold. The prices had collapsed. The interest rates had skyrocketed. The debt that had seemed manageable in 1979 had become a death sentence by 19. Now a young man in an expensive suit was climbing out of a car that cost more than Harold made in 5 years, carrying a briefcase full of papers that would take everything Harold had ever worked for. Let me tell you about Bradley Simmons, because you need to understand the man before you can appreciate what happened to him. Bradley was 28 years old and had worked at First National Bank of Cedar Rapids for 4 years. He'd started as a teller, worked his way up to loan processor, and recently been promoted to Agricultural Asset Recovery Specialist, a fancy title for the man who drove out to failing farms and got the paperwork signed. Bradley had never worked on a farm. He'd grown up in a suburb of Chicago, gone to college on the East Coast, and moved to Iowa because the bank offered him more money than anyone else would. He thought of himself as a professional. Sharp suits, sharp mind, sharp tongue. He thought of farmers as something else, slow, simple, clinging to a dying way of life. He'd done 16 farm foreclosures in the past year. 16 families who'd signed away everything because they had no choice. 16 drives back to Cedar Rapids with signed papers in his briefcase. 16 commissions deposited in his account. The Hendricks farm was number 17. Bradley parked the BMW in front of the farmhouse and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. Hair perfect, tie straight, smile ready. The sympathetic smile he'd practiced, the one that said, "I'm sorry, but business is business." He grabbed his briefcase and walked toward the house. Harold Hendricks was sitting on the porch, waiting. Let me tell you about that first conversation because it set the tone for everything that followed. "Mr. Hendricks?" Bradley extended his hand with practiced warmth. "Bradley Simmons, First National Bank. I believe we spoke on the phone." Harold didn't take the hand. He just looked at Bradley, at the suit that cost more than a month of groceries, at the shoes that had never touched mud, at the smile that didn't reach the eyes. "I know who you are," Harold said. Bradley's hand dropped. His smile tightened. "Well, then you know why I'm here. The bank has been more than patient, Mr. Hendricks. $23,000, 4 months past due. We've sent letters, made calls. I got the letters. Then you understand the situation. The bank is prepared to begin foreclosure proceedings, but we'd prefer to handle this amicably. If you sign the voluntary surrender documents today, we can avoid the legal fees, the public auction, the humiliation," Harold finished. "That's what you mean, isn't it? Sign now. Keep it quiet. Don't make a fuss." Bradley's smile flickered. This wasn't how the conversation usually went. Most farmers were broken by the time he arrived, defeated, desperate, willing to sign anything just to make the nightmare end. Harold Hendricks didn't look broken. He looked like a man waiting for something. "Mr. Hendricks, I understand this is difficult, but the reality is, your farm isn't worth what you owe. The land alone might bring $15,000 at auction, maybe 18 if we're lucky. The equipment," Bradley glanced toward the barn, at the weathered doors, the sagging roof. "I took a look when I was here last month. There's nothing in that barn that would bring $50 at a scrapyard." Harold's expression didn't change. "You went in my barn?" "Just a preliminary assessment. Standard procedure. Bradley opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "Now, if you'll just sign here, here, and here, we can—" "I'd like to show you something first." Bradley paused. "Show me what?" "Something in the barn. Since you already took a look, figured you might want a closer one." This was unusual. Bradley had done 16 foreclosures, and nobody had ever asked to show him anything. They usually just wanted him gone, wanted the papers signed and the nightmare over. But there was something in Harold's voice, something that made Bradley curious despite himself. "Fine," Bradley said. "Show me what's so important. But then we're signing those papers. Let me tell you about the barn, because it's where this story really begins." The Hendricks barn was old, built in 1908, the same year Harold's grandfather had bought the farm. It was a cathedral of weathered wood and rusted metal, filled with the accumulated machinery of 4 generations of farming. There were tractors in various states of decay, a threshing machine from the 1920s, plows, harrows, seeders, cultivators, the iron bones of a century of agriculture. Dust covered everything. Pigeons roosted in the rafters. The air smelled of old oil and older hay. Bradley wrinkled his nose as he stepped through the door. "Mr. Hendricks, I've already assessed this. There's nothing here but scrap. This way." Harold led him through the maze of equipment to the back of the barn, where a canvas tarp covered something large, very large. The shape beneath the tarp was maybe 10 feet long and 6 feet tall, with 2 massive circular bulges on either end. "What is that?" Bradley asked. Harold grabbed a corner of the tarp. "My grandfather bought this paid $200 for it, a fortune back then. Used it to run the thresher, the sawmill, the feed grinder. Powered this whole farm for 30 years. He pulled the tarp away. Bradley stared at what lay beneath. It was a machine, or what had once been a machine. Now it looked like a monument to rust. A massive iron cylinder, maybe 4 feet in diameter, sat on a heavy wooden frame. On either side were 2 enormous wheels, flywheels, though Bradley didn't know the term. Each one 5 feet across, their once bright paint faded to the color of dried blood. Brass fittings poked through the rust in places, green with age. The whole thing was covered in decades of dust, cobwebs, and what appeared to be pigeon droppings. Bradley started to laugh. "This?" He pointed at the rusted hulk. "This is what you wanted to show me. Mr. Hendricks, this isn't worth the scrap metal it's made of. I've seen junk in my time, but this—" He laughed harder, shaking his head. "This is the worst. You know what it is? I know it's garbage. A museum might give you $100 to haul it away. Maybe." Harold didn't respond. He just walked around to the side of the engine and started doing something Bradley couldn't quite see, adjusting something, checking something. "Mr. Hendricks, we're wasting time. The papers." "Just a minute." Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out an oil can, a small brass thing that looked as old as the engine itself. He began applying oil to various points on the machine, moving with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times before. "What are you doing?" "Getting her ready." "Ready for what?" Harold smiled. It was the first smile Bradley had seen from him, a small, quiet smile that made Bradley suddenly nervous. "You ever seen a hit-and-miss engine run, Mr. Simmons?" "A what?" "Didn't think so. Now let me pause here and tell you about hit-and-miss engines, because if you don't understand what they are, you can't understand what happened next." Hit-and-miss engines were the workhorses of American agriculture from the 1890s through the 19... Before electric motors, before diesel tractors, before the internal combustion engine became small and efficient enough to power everything, these massive stationary engines provided power to farms across the country. They were called hit-and-miss because of how they operated. Unlike modern engines that fire on every stroke, these engines only fired when they needed to. When the load was light, the engine would coast on the momentum of its massive flywheels, the intake valve held open, the cylinder just pumping air. When the speed dropped below a certain threshold, the governor would release the valve, fuel would enter the cylinder, the spark would fire, and the engine would hit, a single enormous explosion that sent the flywheels spinning faster again. The sound was unmistakable, a rhythmic pop, 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 with long pauses between each firing, the flywheels whooshing through the air, the whole machine vibrating with contained power. By 1987, most of these engines had been scrapped decades ago. The ones that survived were mostly in museums or private collections. A common hit-and-miss engine, a small one, 5 or 10 horsepower, made by a company that produced thousands, might be worth a few $100s. But the engine in Harold Hendricks's barn was not common. It was a 1903 Fairbanks Morse 25 horsepower Type N, one of the largest and most powerful hit-and-miss engines ever made. Fairbanks Morse had only built a few hundred of them, and most had been scrapped during the steel drives of World War II. By 1987, collectors estimated that fewer than a dozen existed in any condition. A working Fairbanks Morse 25 was worth more than most people's houses. Harold Hendricks knew exactly what he had. Bradley Simmons had no idea. Let me tell you about what happened when Harold started the engine, because it's the first part of the story that people in Cedar County still talk about. Harold finished oiling the engine and stepped back to examine his work. Then he walked to the front of the machine, where a massive crank handle protruded from the crankcase. "You might want to step back," he said to Bradley. "Why?" "Because when this thing fires, it shakes the whole barn." Bradley rolled his eyes but took a few steps back. This was ridiculous. The old man was clearly delusional, thinking this pile of rust could actually... Harold grabbed the crank handle with both hands, set his feet and pulled. The flywheels began to turn. Slowly at first, these wheels weighed over 1,000 pounds combined, and it took real effort to get them moving. But Harold had done this before, many times, and he knew exactly how much momentum he needed. 1 rotation, 2, 3. On the 4th rotation, something extraordinary happened. The engine coughed. Then it fired. The sound was like nothing Bradley had ever heard, a deep, thunderous boom that rattled the walls of the barn, shook dust from the rafters, sent the pigeons exploding into flight. The flywheels, which had been turning slowly, suddenly accelerated, their massive weight carrying them through the next rotation and the next. Then came the rhythm. Boom, whoosh, 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 boom, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The hit-and-miss pattern, each firing sending the flywheels spinning, the momentum carrying them through the silent cycles, the governor controlling the speed with mechanical precision. Bradley stumbled backward. The vibration was incredible. He could feel it through the floor, through the air, through his expensive suit and his polished shoes and his carefully combed hair. The barn itself seemed to be humming, resonating with the power of this ancient machine. What? Bradley's voice cracked. He had to shout to be heard over the engine. "What is this thing?" Harold stood beside his engine with his hand on one of the flywheels, feeling the smooth rush of iron through his fingers. His face had changed. There was pride there now, and something deeper. Love? Maybe? The love of a man for a machine that had been part of his family for 3 generations. "This," Harold shouted back, "is a 1903 Fairbanks Morse Type N, 25 horsepower, one of maybe 10 left in the world." 10? But that means, it means this junk is worth more than your car, your house, and your career combined. Bradley's face went pale, and that's when the barn door opened. Let me tell you about Martin Ashworth, because he's the reason this story has a happy ending. Martin Ashworth was 55 years old and had been collecting antique engines for 30 years. He owned a construction company in Dubuque, a successful one, successful enough that he could indulge his passion for old machinery without worrying about the cost. His collection included over 40 hit-and-miss engines of various makes and sizes. He had Hercules engines and Stover engines and International Harvester engines. He had engines that had powered sawmills, and engines that had pumped water, and engines that had run printing presses, but he didn't have a Fairbanks Morse 20. Nobody had a Fairbanks Morse 25. The last one to sell publicly had gone at auction in 1979 for $62,000, and that one hadn't been running. A working Fairbanks 25 in good condition with original paint and brass fittings. Martin Ashworth had been searching for one for 20 years. The night before Bradley Simmons drove out to foreclose on the Hendricks farm, Harold Hendricks had made a phone call. "Mr. Ashworth, this is Harold Hendricks, Cedar County. We met at the Threshers reunion in Mount Pleasant. I remember you, Mr. Hendricks. You had that little John Deere hit and miss. Nice piece. I have something else. Something I haven't shown anyone. But I'm in some trouble now, and I might need to sell it." "What is it?" 1903 Fairbanks Morse. 25 horsepower. Type N. There had been silence on the line. A long silence. "You're joking." "I'm not. My grandfather bought it new. Been in the barn for 50 years, but I've kept it running. Fire it up once a month just like he taught my father, just like my father taught me." "Mr. Hendricks," Martin Ashworth's voice had been shaking. "I'll be there tomorrow. Don't sell it to anyone else. Don't let anyone else even see it. I'll be there tomorrow." Now let me tell you about the moment Martin Ashworth walked into that barn, because it's the second part of the story that people in Cedar County still talk about. The engine was still running when Martin pushed open the barn door. He stopped in the doorway, briefcase in one hand, the other hand rising slowly to his mouth. Boom, whoosh, whoosh, boom. The flywheels were spinning, their ancient paint catching the light that streamed through the gaps in the barn walls. The brass fittings, oilers, valve covers, the nameplate on the cylinder gleamed beneath the surface grime. The whole machine was alive, doing exactly what it had been built to do 84 years ago. Martin Ashworth was not a man who cried easily. He was a construction contractor, a businessman, a practical man who dealt in concrete and steel and numbers that added up. But there were tears in his eyes as he walked toward the engine. "My God," he said. "My God, Harold. She's beautiful." Bradley Simmons watched this newcomer with confusion. Who was this man? Why was he looking at a rusty engine like it was the Mona Lisa? "Mr. Ashworth," Harold said, "this is Bradley Simmons. He's from the bank. He's here to take my farm." Martin Ashworth turned to look at Bradley. His eyes moved over the suit, the tie, the briefcase full of papers. His expression didn't change. "How much?" Martin asked Harold, ignoring Bradley completely. "Bank says I owe $23,000. "I'm not asking what you owe. I'm asking what you want." Harold looked at his engine, at the machine his grandfather had bought, his father had maintained, he himself had kept running for 50 years. He thought about the farm, about the land, about all the memories soaked into this ground. "I want to keep my farm," he said. "I want to pay off the bank and have enough left over to fix the roof and maybe buy some new equipment. I want to die on this land, same as my father did, same as his father did." Martin Ashworth nodded. He set his briefcase on a workbench, opened it, and turned it around so Harold could see what was inside. Cash, stacks of $100 bills, banded in $10,000 bundles. "There's $250,000 in this briefcase," Martin said. "For the engine, the flywheels, the original cart, and any parts or documentation you have. Is that enough?" Let me tell you about Bradley Simmons's face at that moment, because it's the image that Harold Hendricks carried with him for the rest of his life. The color drained out of Bradley's cheeks. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes went from the briefcase full of cash to the rusty engine to Harold Hendricks, and then back to the briefcase. 200. Bradley couldn't finish the sentence. $250,000, Martin repeated. "For an engine that you—" He turned to look at Bradley, and there was no warmth in his expression. "Called junk. That you said wasn't worth the scrap metal." Bradley took a step backward. I couldn't have known." "No, you couldn't have, because you didn't bother to learn." Martin turned back to Harold. "Is the price acceptable?" Harold was looking at the briefcase. He was thinking about 30 years of farming, about the wife he'd buried under the oak tree, about the children who'd grown up and moved away, about the grandchildren who only visited on holidays now. He was thinking about $23,000 owed and $250,000 offered. He was thinking about the look on Bradley Simmons's face. "It's more than acceptable," Harold said, "but I have one condition." "Name it." "You let me fire her up whenever you bring her to a show. I want to be the one who starts her, same as I've always been, same as my father was and his father before him." Martin Ashworth smiled. "Mr. Hendricks, you can start that engine at every show for as long as you live. It would be my honor." They shook hands. Let me tell you about what happened next, because the humiliation of Bradley Simmons was not yet complete. Harold turned to the young banker, who was still standing frozen near the barn door. "Mr. Simmons, I believe I owe the bank $23,000? Bradley nodded weakly. "Well, I'd like to pay that off now. In cash. Do you have the paperwork for that?" Bradley's mouth opened and closed. I have foreclosure papers. You don't have payoff documents? Isn't that standard procedure? I didn't think. Nobody ever pays off their loans in cash." Harold's voice was mild, but his eyes were hard. "Seems like a strange assumption for a banker to make." "I can call the office," Bradley said. His voice cracked. "They can fax the paperwork." "You do that. Mr. Ashworth and I will be having some coffee in the house. Join us when you have the documents ready for me to sign." Harold shut down the engine, the booms fading, the flywheels slowly losing momentum, the barn falling silent, and walked out with Martin Ashworth. Bradley Simmons was left alone in the barn, surrounded by what he now understood was not junk at all, holding a briefcase full of papers that were suddenly worthless. He stood there for a long time. "Let me tell you about the phone call Bradley made, because it tells you everything about what kind of man he was and what kind of man he might become." Bradley walked out of the barn and sat in his BMW for 10 minutes before he could bring himself to pick up the car phone. His hands were shaking. His thoughts were racing. $250,000 for an engine, a rusty, ancient, obsolete engine that he had laughed at, that he had called worthless. He had been doing this job for 4 years. 16 foreclosures. 16 families who had signed away everything because they had no choice. How many of them had been hiding treasure in their barns? How many of them had owned something priceless without knowing it? Or worse, while knowing it but being too desperate to find a buyer in time? How many times had Bradley walked past something worth more than his career and never known it? He picked up the phone and called his supervisor. "Bill, it's Bradley. The Hendricks foreclosure. Good news, I hope?" Bradley closed his eyes. "The farmer is paying off the loan. In full. Cash." There was a pause. "He's paying? How?" "He sold something. What did he sell?" "An old engine. An antique engine. A collector just paid him $250,000 for it." Another pause. Longer this time. $250,000? For something you assessed as worthless?" "Yes, sir." "Bradley, do you know what this means?" Bradley knew exactly what it meant. It meant his career at First National Bank was over. It meant he had cost the bank a foreclosure they were counting on. Worse, it meant he had revealed himself to be incompetent, a man who couldn't tell treasure from trash. "I'll have my resignation on your desk by—" "Resignation? Bradley, I'm promoting you." "What?" "You just learned something that would take most people 20 years to figure out. You learned that you don't know everything. You learned that the farmers you've been foreclosing on might have assets you never dreamed of. You learned humility." "I don't understand." "Most people in your position would have driven away and never told anyone what happened. They would have buried the story, pretended the foreclosure fell through for some other reason. But you called me and told me the truth. That tells me you're the kind of man who can learn from his mistakes." But Bradley sat in his BMW, staring at the barn, trying to process what he was hearing. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to go inside that farmhouse. I want you to have coffee with Mr. Hendricks and his collector friend. I want you to apologize for what you said about his barn. And then I want you to come back to the office and help me figure out how we can do better. How we can actually help these farmers instead of just taking their land. Let me tell you about that coffee, because it's where the story really ends." Bradley Simmons sat at Harold Hendricks's kitchen table with a cup of coffee he couldn't drink. Across from him sat Harold and Martin Ashworth, who were discussing the logistics of moving a 2-ton engine from Cedar County to Dubuque. "I'll bring a flatbed next week," Martin was saying. "We'll need a crane to lift her. The flywheels alone weigh 800 pounds each. I'll have her ready, cleaned up, fresh oil on all the bearings. She'll look better than she has in 50 years. Bradley cleared his throat. Both men looked at him. "Mr. Hendricks, I owe you an apology." Harold's expression didn't change. "Do you now? I laughed at your engine, called it junk. I was arrogant and ignorant, and I'm sorry. Apology accepted." Bradley blinked. "That's it? What did you expect? That I'd make you grovel?" Harold shook his head. "I'm too old for grudges, Mr. Simmons. You made a mistake. You're owning up to it. That's more than most people do. Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How did you know? How did you know that engine was worth anything?" Harold was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the barn where the engine had lived for 84 years. "My grandfather told my father, and my father told me. Take care of that engine, they said. Keep it running. Never let anyone tell you it's worthless, because the men who made it don't make things like that anymore. I didn't know exactly what it was worth. Well, I just knew it was valuable, not because of the money, but because of what it represented." "What does it represent?" "The way things used to be built. Made to last. Made to be fixed, not thrown away. Made by craftsmen who took pride in their work." Harold looked at Bradley. "How old is that car of yours?"
The BMW? 3 years.
"How long will it last?" "I don't know. 10 years? Maybe 15? That engine out there is 84 years old. With proper care, it'll run for another 100. Your car costs more, does more, goes faster, but in 50 years it'll be a pile of rust in a junkyard. My engine will still be running." Martin Ashworth nodded. "That's why collectors pay what we pay. We're not buying machines. We're buying history. We're buying craftsmanship. We're buying proof that people used to build things that lasted." Bradley sat with that thought for a long time. "Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end with a paid-off loan." Bradley Simmons did not quit his job at First National Bank. Instead, he took his supervisor's advice and became a different kind of banker. He specialized in working with struggling farmers, not to foreclose on them, but to help them find alternatives, to help them discover what assets they might have, to give them time. He developed a reputation as the banker who actually cared, the one who would walk through a barn not to assess scrap value but to really look, the one who would ask questions, make phone calls, connect farmers with collectors and historians who might be interested in what they had. Over the next 10 years, Bradley Simmons helped save 43 farms that would otherwise have been foreclosed. Not all of them had priceless engines hidden in their barns, but many of them had something: antique furniture, original land grants, collections of old coins or stamps or tools, things that looked like junk to people who didn't know any better. Bradley learned to know better. Let me tell you about Harold Hendricks, because he lived another 12 years. Harold used the money from the engine sale to pay off all his debts, fix up the farmhouse, and buy a new tractor, not a fancy one, just a good, reliable machine that would do the work he needed done. He kept farming until 1994, when his knees finally gave out, and his doctor told him he couldn't manage the land anymore. He sold the acreage to a neighbor, a young farmer just starting out, who promised to take care of it the way Harold had. Harold kept the farmhouse. He lived there alone, surrounded by memories, until he died peacefully in his sleep in March of 1999, exactly 12 years after Bradley Simmons had driven up his driveway to take everything away. His children found a note tucked into his Bible, written in his shaky hand. "I have lived a good life on this land. I have known joy and sorrow, prosperity and hardship, love and loss. I have watched the seasons change 74 times and never tired of the sight. I have kept my father's promises and my grandfather's engine running. I have paid my debts and kept my pride. What more could a man ask for? Let me tell you about the engine, because it's still running. Martin Ashworth kept his promise at every antique engine show he attended, and he attended dozens. Harold Hendricks was there to start the Fairbanks Morse. The old man would climb up onto the cart, oil the bearings with his little brass can, and crank the flywheels until the engine fired. Boom! Whoosh! Whoosh! Boom! 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 The sound never failed to draw a crowd. Children would gather around, eyes wide. Old-timers would shake their heads and remember when engines like this powered every farm in America. Young engineers would study the mechanism, marveling at its simplicity and its power. After Harold died, Martin Ashworth kept the tradition going. He found Harold's grandson, a man named Daniel Hendricks, who had moved to California but came back for the funeral, and taught him how to start the engine. "Your great-great-grandfather bought this machine," Martin told him. "Your family has been starting it for almost 100 years. That shouldn't end." Daniel Hendricks comes to Iowa every summer now. He starts the engine at the Midwest Antique Engine and Tractor Show, just like his great-grandfather did, just like his great-great-grandfather did before him. The sound is the same as it was in 1903. Boom! Whoosh! 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 Boom! 120 years old, and still running. That's the story of Harold Hendricks and the worthless engine. The story of a young banker who learned that he didn't know everything, and an old farmer who knew exactly what he had. Bradley Simmons called that engine junk. He was wrong. Some things are worth more than anyone can see, more than any banker can assess, more than any spreadsheet can calculate. Some things are priceless, and sometimes the people who look like they have nothing are the ones who have everything. That's the difference between knowing the price of something and knowing its value. Harold Hendricks knew the value. Bradley Simmons had to learn it. And the engine, that ancient, rusty, magnificent engine, is still teaching that lesson today.